the earth trembles. It is not an earthquake, but something more deliberate, more rhythmic. For a young Swedish musketeer on the plain of Klisov, a veteran of 1,000 battles at the age of 18, the horizon transforms into a living nightmare. First, it is a murmur, then a roar, and finally a vision of feathers, steel, and leopard pelts. Thousands of 6-meter-long lances, weapons of a bygone era, descend in a deadly unison, their tips glinting under the Polish sun. The sound of 3,000 war horses at a full gallop becomes a thunder that drowns out the officer's shouts and the frantic beat of his own heart. The wall of pikes and muskets, the pride of Europe's most modern army, which seemed impenetrable, is about to be struck by the hammer of God. This was the charge of Klisov, one of the most spectacular and terrifying acts of cavalry in military history. It was a perfect tactical success, a moment when heavy cavalry, considered by many an obsolete relic, proved it, could still break and annihilate the world's finest infantry. The Polish winged Hussars, the embodiment of medieval warfare, crashed against modernity and shattered it to pieces. The image of these horsemen breaking the Swedish lines has become a legend, a symbol of indomitable valor. However, this is the story told to inspire, not the one analyzed to learn. The legend of their glorious charge is a smokescreen, concealing a much more bitter and revealing truth. The truth is that the charge of Klisov was an act of isolated tactical genius within a strategic catastrophe. It was a masterpiece executed within the framework of an idiotic plan. The Hussars did not fail. Their charge was flawless, lethal, and decisive. Those who failed were the commanders behind them, the men who were meant to exploit the breach the cavalry had opened with their own blood. This is not the story of a legendary victory. This is the story of how the last great roar of medieval cavalry was engulfed by the absolute silence of Allied incompetence, proving that on the modern battlefield, valor without a coherent plan is simply glorified suicide. Commanding this magnificent but doomed cavalry force was the Grand Crown Hetman, Stanisław Jabłonowski. A veteran commander, he embodied the spirit of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He led Eastern Europe's most feared arm, the winged Hussars, and his faith in his men was absolute and unshakable. Yet, this confidence was contrasted by his deep and justified mistrust of his Saxon allies, and above all of his own king, Augustus II the Strong. Jabłonowski was a professional of war trapped in a conflict led by a monarch, known more for his physical strength and his mistresses than for his strategic acumen. He knew his Hussars could break any line, but he doubted the rest of the army had the ability or the will to follow them. Jabłonowski's force consisted of approximately 3,000 Polish horsemen, the elite core of a combined Polish-Saxon army, that theoretically numbered some 24,000 men. For the Hussars, this battle was more than a simple geopolitical maneuver in the Great Northern War. It was a defense of their homeland against Swedish invasion and the preservation of their identity as the nation's preeminent warrior caste. Their motivation was a mixture of national honor, feudal duty, and a fierce pride in their martial heritage. They were the living legacy of a tradition of horse warfare stretching back centuries, and at Klisov, they were determined to prove that this tradition was still relevant and deadly in the new century of gunpowder. Facing them was the giant of the age, King Charles X of Sweden, the Lion of the North, a military prodigy who, despite his youth, was already considered a tactical genius. He was aggressive, utterly fearless, and led from the front, inspiring fanatical devotion in his men. His Swedish army, of about 12,000 soldiers, was the most modern, disciplined, and professional military machine in Europe. Its strength lay in the iron discipline of its infantry, trained to deliver devastating musket volleys at close range, and in its aggressive tactical doctrine known as go po, go on, which prioritized the shock of offensive firepower over any defensive consideration. However, Charles IV's genius had a blind spot, a fatal flaw born from the arrogance of modernity, a tactical contempt for what he considered antiquated cavalry. Fully trusting in the discipline of his infantry and the power of his muskets, he anchored his right flank on a vast swamp, believing the difficult terrain would be a natural and impassable protection against a heavy cavalry charge. He completely underestimated the ability of the Polish Hussars to traverse terrain that would stop other horsemen and, more importantly, He underestimated the sheer kinetic force they could generate even after such a difficult maneuver. He left his strongest flank, in his opinion, dangerously exposed to the only force in the world capable of exploiting it. The battlefield of Klissov was defined by a central and deceptive character: the swamp. This expanse of marshland and waterlogged ground dominated the landscape and dictated the strategy of both sides. For King Augustus II and his Saxon commander, Marshal von Steinau, the swamp was seen as a defensive barrier, an obstacle that would protect the flank of their Saxon infantry and channel the Swedish attack. For King Charles V, it was the exact opposite: a defensive anchor for his right flank, a terrain feature that allowed him to concentrate his forces in the center. Both commanders saw it as a static element, a wall. Only Jabłonowski, the Polish commander, saw it for what it truly was: a gateway. The fatal error was not a decision made in the heat of battle, but a fundamental flaw in the design of the Allied battle plan. The strategy of Augustus II and von Steinau was entirely passive and depended on a single fragile point of success: the charge of the Polish cavalry. They had no contingency plan, no second phase, no coherent strategy to exploit the breach the Hussars would inevitably create. They deployed their numerous Saxon infantry with the swamp at their backs, a position that not only prevented them from maneuvering effectively, but also cut off any path for an orderly retreat. It was a one-punch strategy, an all-or-nothing plan that placed the fate of the entire army in the hands of its 3,000 horsemen, without offering them any support in return. The battle was lost before the first shot was fired. The maneuver was bold to the point of madness. While the Saxon center waited passively, Jabłonowski's 3,000 Polish horsemen began a difficult and arduous crossing of the swamp that was supposed to stop them. The heavy war horses sank in the mud, but the skill and determination of the riders drove them forward. They emerged on the flank of the Swedish army, where no one expected them, turning Charles VI's protection into a death trap. They quickly regrouped, a gleaming line of steel and feathers, and then Jabłonowski gave the order. With a cry that echoed across the plain, the greatest and most feared cavalry in Europe launched its charge. The impact was apocalyptic. The Swedish right flank, composed of their best infantry and cavalry, was caught by surprise and simply pulverized. The long 6-meter hollow lances, the kopia, struck the first line of pikes with devastating force, shattering the formation that had withstood all other European cavalry. The lances splintered after the initial impact, as designed, and the Hussars drew their sabers, the sabla, and drove deep into the enemy ranks. They became a whirlwind of cutting steel, slaughtering the disorganized infantry and sweeping away the Swedish cavalry that tried to counterattack. It was an absolute tactical success, a butchery executed with terrifying precision. In a matter of minutes, the right flank of the Swedish army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The Hussars had not only broken the line, but had utterly annihilated it, continuing their unstoppable advance. At the height of their success, they overran the Swedish artillery positions, capturing the enemy cannons and silencing the fire that had been punishing their Saxon allies. They had created a massive breach in the enemy army, exposing its center and rear. The path to the total annihilation of Charles V's army was open. It was the golden opportunity, the decisive moment that any general dreams of creating on the battlefield. But then the critical enemy revealed itself, and it was not the Swedes. It was their own ally. While the Polish Hussars bled and died to open the door to victory, the Saxon center, with 16,000 men, remained motionless. Marshal von Steinau, paralyzed by indecision or incompetence, refused to order the advance. He watched from a safe distance as the greatest opportunity of the war evaporated. Before his eyes, desperate Polish officers sent messengers pleading for the support they needed to secure their advance and crush the Swedish center. But the orders never came. The Saxon infantry stood still, as mere spectators to the glorious but futile carnage their allies had unleashed. The golden opportunity turned to dust. Von Steinau's inaction not only squandered the victory, but condemned the valiant Hussars who had offered it to him. What should have been a coordinated advance of the entire army became the isolated charge of a single unit. The one-punch battle plan had worked, the blow had been struck, but there was no one to deliver the coup de grace. History rarely offers such clear moments of military incompetence, where victory is served on a silver platter and refused by the hand that is supposed to take it. The silence of the Saxon orders was more devastating than any Swedish cannon. It was in this moment of chaos and wasted opportunity that the true genius of Charles the Thien shone through. Instead of panicking at the sight of his right flank disintegrating, the young king demonstrated astonishing calm and tactical clarity. He personally galloped to the collapsing sector, ignoring the danger, and began to rally the surviving troops. His charismatic presence was enough to halt the rout and form a new, improvised defensive line. But his most brilliant move was yet to come. Instead of simply plugging the hole, he saw a new opportunity in the disaster. The Polish. Victory had created a vulnerability. Charles X reacted with incredible speed. He ordered several infantry battalions from his center, which were not under pressure due to the Saxon inaction, to perform a 90-degree turn. These units pivoted, and instead of facing the Saxons before them, marched to attack the now exposed and unprotected flank of the Polish cavalry. The Swedish king transformed the battlefield in an instant. The Hussars, who had been the hunters, suddenly found the trap had closed around them. The genius of Charles the Thien had turned his enemy's greatest success into their greatest doom. The Hussars, victorious but exhausted, found themselves in an impossible position. Their lances, their primary shock weapons, were broken. Their horses were tired from the charge through the swamp and the subsequent combat. And most importantly, they were completely alone, with no infantry support to consolidate their gains. The glorious charge had penetrated so deep into the enemy lines that they were now isolated, a vulnerable salient in a sea of Swedish muskets. The iron discipline of Charles X's infantry began to take its toll. Surrounded on three sides, the Hussars were subjected to methodical and deadly volley fire. The Swedish infantry, trained to reload and fire with fearsome speed, began to bring down the riders and their mounts. The glorious charge transformed into a desperate fight for survival. The Hussars, the elite of shock warfare, were forced to fight a battle of attrition for which they were not equipped, trapped in a killing field created by the incompetence of their own leaders and the genius of their enemy. The momentum was lost, replaced by the grim mathematics of gunpowder. While the Hussars fought to escape the trap, the main Swedish attack finally materialized. Charles X's infantry, emboldened by the success of their counterattack, advanced on the Saxon line. The Saxons, demoralized by hours of inaction, poorly positioned with a swamp at their backs and watching the Polish elite being slaughtered, offered little resistance. Their line broke almost immediately. What followed was not a retreat, but a chaotic and shameful rout. Thousands of soldiers threw down their weapons and fled, only to be pursued and cut down by the Swedish cavalry. The battle was lost in the most catastrophic and humiliating way possible. The Allied army, which outnumbered the Swedes almost 2-1, completely disintegrated. The tactical genius of the Hussars' charge had been utterly nullified by the strategic cowardice of the Saxon command. The field of Klisov became a monument to a timeless military truth. An army of lions led by a deer is doomed to defeat. The Hussars had done their part. They had lived up to their legend, but the legend was not enough to win the war. The collapse was total. The surviving Hussars had to fight their way back through enemy lines to retreat, suffering heavy losses in the process. Jabłonowski, who had led the charge, saw his magnificent force decimated not by the skill of the enemy, but by the betrayal of his allies. The defeat at Klisov was not merely a tactical loss. It was a humiliation that shook the foundations of the Polish-Saxon alliance and left the way open for Charles V to continue his conquest of Poland. The most spectacular charge in history had culminated in one of the most shameful defeats. The aftermath of the battle painted a brutally clear picture of the catastrophe. The casualty figures told the story that the legend of the charge would try to conceal. The Polish-Saxon army suffered around 2,000 killed, and another 1,000 men were captured. In stark contrast, the victorious Swedish army, which had been on the verge of annihilation, lost a mere 300 men. This shocking disparity was not a reflection of valor, but of organization and leadership. It showed the lethal effectiveness of the Swedish infantry when allowed to fight on its own terms and the absolute collapse of cohesion and morale on the Allied side. Klisov was not a closely fought battle. It was a massacre followed by a pursuit. The fate of the defeated commander, King Augustus II the Strong, was as humiliating as the defeat itself. He was forced into a hasty retreat, abandoning his artillery and much of his baggage train. Shortly after, he lost his capital, Krakow, to the unstoppable advance of Charles XIII. The defeat at Klisov was a decisive nail in the coffin of his first reign in Poland. His prestige was shattered, his army decimated, and his authority fatally undermined. The battle exposed his lack of ability as a military commander and accelerated the process that would eventually lead to his temporary deposition from the Polish throne in favor of a Swedish-backed candidate. For the surviving Hussars, the bitterness of defeat was immeasurable. They had performed one of the most successful charges in military history, breaking an enemy considered invincible, only to see their feet turned to ashes by the inaction of their allies. They had paid the price of victory in blood, but had been denied the prize. They returned from the field not as victorious heroes, but as the remnants of an elite force sacrificed on the altar of incompetence. The glow of their charge had been extinguished, leaving only the cold, dark ember of what might have been, and never was. Beyond the loss of a battle or a capital, Klisov marked a symbolic and military turning point. It was the swan song of the winged Hussars, as the decisive force on the battlefields of Europe. The battle demonstrated in the most brutal way possible that, however spectacular and devastating their charge, heavy cavalry could no longer win battles on its own. It was facing a new era of warfare dominated by combined arms armies, where disciplined infantry, mobile artillery, and competent command were the ingredients of victory. The Hussars' charge was the glorious flare of a medieval candle just before it, was extinguished by the modern wind of gunpowder and strategy. The long-term consequence was the irreversible decline of heavy cavalry as the primary shock weapon. Although cavalry would continue to play crucial roles in reconnaissance, pursuit, and flank charges, the idea that a force of lancers could break the center of a modern infantry army was discredited. Klisov was a costly lesson. Valor and martial tradition, by themselves, were no longer enough. War had become a more complex system, a machine in which every gear had to work in perfect synchrony. The Hussars' charge was a magnificent part, but the Allied machine was broken. Ironically, the way the event became a foundational myth involved a deliberate act of historical editing. The charge itself, divorced from its context of catastrophic defeat, was extracted and polished into a national legend. It became the last great moment of glory for the winged Hussars, an eternal symbol of Polish bravery and martial spirit. The moment. They broke the Swedish lines is remembered, but the fact that the battle was lost is conveniently forgotten. It is a perfect example of how nations build their myths, by selecting the fragments of heroism and discarding the uncomfortable truth of the incompetence and strategic failure that surrounds them. Thus, the memory of Klisov was split into two parallel realities. For military historians, it is a case study on the importance of command and control, inter-arm cooperation, and the failure of a single-point strategy. For Polish popular memory, however, it is simply the charge. The image of the winged horseman descending upon the Swedes has become a cultural icon, a source of national pride that transcends the bitter reality of the final outcome. The legend survives because it is more inspiring than the truth, a story of pure valor that refuses to be stained by the errors of the men who made it possible. Perhaps the most ironic and painful detail of the charge of Klisov lies in the fate of the Swedish cannons. At the climax of their advance, the Hussars, having annihilated the right flank, overran the enemy artillery batteries. They had captured the most important tactical prize on the battlefield. With those cannons in their possession, they could have turned them against the Swedish center, sealing the victory. However, cavalry is not equipped to handle artillery. They desperately needed the Saxon infantry to advance, secure the guns, and begin to use them. But the infantry never came. And so, the Hussars found themselves in the absurd position of having achieved a victory so complete that it had become useless. They were forced to abandon the captured cannons as they fought to escape the trap their own leaders had put them in. They had to relinquish control of the weapons they had won with their blood because there was no one to help them use them. This single episode is the perfect metaphor for the entire battle, an act of martial brilliance and superhuman valor completely nullified and rendered a tragic futility by strategic incompetence. The Hussars did not just charge towards glory, they charged into the heart of a victory they were never allowed to claim.